Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, we're going to travel across the steppes, deserts, and mountains, following the trails of ancient caravans. Moreover, we will travel over time. You have certainly heard of the Silk Road, a trade route that linked China in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, lasting for centuries. But how exactly did it work? Why did it appear? Was it a single route or were there several? Who transported these precious goods over thousands of miles? What unfolded during more than 1,500 years of activity? How did the world change as a result of this early form of trade globalization? This is what we are going to explore. But before we do, I'd like to take 1 minute of your time to let you know that we do have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly contribute to our work financially. If you join, you will get various new things, like the possibility to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds, and regular bonus episodes. We already have 3 episodes available only to our Patreons, with the latest one being about the Library of Alexandria, and the 4th one is coming soon. You will be able to download all these audios, and you will have your say on the choice of topics. This topic was selected by our Patreons. We have advanced releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we may continue developing Lights Out Library, which we enjoy so much. You will find a link in the description box and in the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume later or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. If you wish to, you may close your eyes and forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. But before we begin, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. When you exhale, release the tension in your shoulders, your neck. Feel your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, let's begin, shall we? The Silk Road is an invitation to ask ourselves about the origins of long-distance trade in human history. Interestingly, long before the establishment of the Silk Road, historians had pondered the inception of this specific route, or more accurately, this network. We'll explore why. The creation of this network is generally attributed to the 2nd century BC, some 2,100 years ago. It resulted from the expansion of the imperial Han dynasty in China into Central Asia, pacifying regions previously deemed too treacherous to cross. This move positioned the Han Empire adjacent to other large empires of the time, the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire, with its heart in Persia, stretched from Turkey to Afghanistan. These two large entities functioned as a link between East Asia and the Mediterranean Sea. Both empires were mutually interested in trade, buying and selling goods they required. Consequently, it was this shared interest that initiated the inception of such an extensive trade route. However, exchanges across Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa existed long before this. This fact is demonstrated by, for instance, the discovery of remnants that are likely Chinese silk in ancient Egypt, dating back to the 11th century BC, a full millennium before the opening of the Silk Road. Another instance was the unearthing of silk and belt ornaments of Chinese origin in a tomb near Stuttgart in Germany, dated to the 8th century BC. So goods were capable of far-reaching travel even without the existence of the Silk Road. Another critical trading network across Eurasia was the steppe route, which was established at least 2,000 years before the Silk Road came into existence. On this steppe route, diverse goods, including silk, were exchanged, as well as fur, precious stones, and jewels, musical instruments, and notably Central Asian horses, which were coveted by the Chinese. This informal steppe route was kept functioning for many generations by the nomadic tribes residing from Ukraine to Mongolia, and we know they existed thanks to archaeological discoveries, where artifacts were located in tombs or ruins thousands of miles from their origin. Examples include the silk pieces I mentioned before, discovered in Egypt and Germany, and precious stones, such as jade and lapis lazuli, that had traveled significant distances. It is believed that these long-distance exchanges appeared because of the lifestyle of the peoples who occupied the steppes of Eastern Europe and Asia. Even though they were in contact with fixed settlements and had developed their own crafts and a certain level of technical advancement, they maintained their nomadic lifestyle. As such, they were often on the move over a large territory without fixed borders. They had large areas they considered their own. And they also had neighbors and were well placed to connect peoples living far apart by transporting goods. This steppe route was certainly not as intentional as the Silk Road would be. It seems that it appeared spontaneously as a vast network of peoples who knew their immediate neighbors, and across this vast area, goods and cultures circulated. Another precursor trade route to the Silk Road was the so-called Jade Road. Jade was very sought after in China. It came from Central Asia and Burma, crossing the Himalayan mountains to arrive in Yunnan, in the south of China. This journey traversed some of the most remote and difficult regions in the world. Jade, a mineral that can range in color from green to white, was highly valued because it was believed to provide power and protection to kings and emperors. As a result, they patronized this trade. An illustration of cultural influences from afar is seen in Chinese crafts made with jade from the first millennium BC. These pieces drew inspiration from the styles of the Scythians, nomadic peoples from the steppes of Western Asia and Eastern Europe, centuries before opening the Silk Road. Other people with whom the Chinese traded were the Sogdians, who lived in what is today Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. In the first millennium BC, Sogdiana, the land of the Sogdians, constantly changed hands under the influence of different invaders. These included the Persians, the Persian Empire, and the Greeks or the Macedonians, following the invasion of Alexander the Great. Despite frequent changes in governance, Sogdiana maintained a propensity for international trade, with various cities extracting important resources from it. The most notable city was Samarkand, which eventually became one of the most significant stops for caravans along the Silk Road. The importance of these examples regarding the steppe route, or the Jade Road, is that commercial routes had appeared before the Silk Road. This explains how Chinese artifacts ended up in Europe or Egypt. The artifacts most likely arrived there in very small quantities and almost accidentally, after having changed hands several times, rather than through a trade route with the explicit intent to export them from China to the other side of the ancient world. The impulse to create a commercial road was given by the Chinese in the 2nd century BC. But why? China had unified under the first emperor Qin, and the subsequent Han dynasty expanded towards Central Asia. The Han administration became aware that significant developed cities were situated inland in Central Asia. Realizing their potential, they dispatched embassies. The emperor received reports from his ambassadors, particularly Zhang Qian in late 2nd century BC, who advocated for the establishment of trade relations. Central Asia offered attractive goods, including gold, precious stones, and other valuable materials, as well as horses. These commodities could be traded for Chinese products like tea, silk, lacquer, and various handcrafted items. Ambassador Zhang Qian also reported on neighboring countries further west and south, such as Persia, which was controlled by the Parthians, and other nations such as India and Mesopotamia. One detail that particularly intrigued China was the fact that Central Asia bred tall and powerful horses, superior in combat than those in China. As the Chinese frequently faced skirmishes with nomadic tribes along their northern and western frontiers, peoples who relied heavily on horses, the Chinese found such horses extremely valuable. So, with the emperor's blessing, the creation and supervision of a commercial route was established, stretching thousands of miles from China to Central Asia. This policy was consistently upheld for decades. Merchants in Central Asia realized that a demand for these Chinese products likely extended even further west, towards the Middle East. Believing potential clients to exist in those regions, they transported these desired goods overland, continually extending what is now known as the Silk Road. Also, during the 1st century BC, an alternative route to India was opened by sea. It initiated in the north of modern Vietnam, in the region of Jiaoqi, which at the time was ruled by the Chinese, and navigated through ports on the coasts of India and Sri Lanka. This route extended all the way to the Middle East, culminating in the Red Sea. Ships on this maritime route, or caravans on the land route, did not traverse the entire distance from China to the Western world. From the beginning, trade along this extensive route was facilitated by middlemen. Indian traders purchased the goods in India and transported them westward to resell at a profit. Similar practices were adopted by peoples from the Central Asian steppes and deserts on the land route. So the first merchants on the Silk Road never journeyed to the opposite end. They brought the goods to ports, trading posts, or marketplaces, where the goods changed hands, sometimes multiple times, and carried on until they reached their final destination months later. This is why many historians consider the term Silk Road a bit misleading. In fact, there were several routes, and they formed a network with alternative paths, not a single land road. The land route through Eurasia was significant, but it is believed that the most important one, in terms of the volume of goods traded over the centuries, was the maritime route. This route crossed the Indian Ocean, and the products that transited were not only from China or the Mediterranean. There were also spices from Southeast Asia, and gold and ivory from Africa, as well as Indian textiles and gems. In the 1st century BC, while the Han Dynasty ruled over a unified China in the east, the dominating power in the west was the Roman Republic, soon to become the Roman Empire. As the Chinese expanded to their west, the Romans were expanding to their east, reaching as far as Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Between these two blocs, Rome and China, there were several kingdoms and states. Of these, the most important was the Persian Parthian Empire, which would become an archenemy of the Romans. But despite the distance, the Romans and Chinese still became aware of each other. Archaeological finds on both sides attest to an indirect trade between the two. In China, Roman glassware and silverware have been found in tombs. Additionally, many Roman coins and medallions from the 1st century AD onwards have been discovered. Sometimes coins are not the best indicator, as they could have arrived in China several centuries after they were minted. However, there are enough sites and artifacts to confirm that they arrived in China 2,000 years prior. Interestingly, many Roman remains were found in Jiaoqi, a historical region in North Vietnam, which was the final stop of the maritime road on the Chinese side. But this trade was indirect. The real level of mutual awareness, namely how much each side knew about the other, remains a topic of speculation and investigation. There could have been Chinese embassies in Rome, but it's hard to conclusively determine this based on Roman archives. This is because envoys from the east of their empire, beyond the Parthian Empire, were collectively referred to as Saras by the Romans. They did not clearly distinguish between Indians, Chinese, or other Asian peoples in their chronicles and literature. Apart from official embassies, multiple encounters with merchants from Serica, this undefined land of the Saras, are mentioned in Roman writings. But there is no certainty that these merchants actually were Chinese. On the Chinese side, knowledge of the Romans did not seem to me much more extensive. They had a name from the Roman Empire, Daqin. Chinese ambassadors to the Parthian Empire, with whom they had regular diplomatic relations, wrote reports, including secondhand testimonies, about Rome in the 1st century AD. In some texts, Chinese historians of the past allude to Roman embassies in China during the 2nd century. However, this claim is dubious, as these chronicles were written later, and such embassies are absent from Roman historiography. So, what we can conclude from this is that the Chinese and the Romans, the two most formidable empires of the world in the 1st centuries of our era, were aware of each other's existence. They knew that some of the products they received came from the other empire, including Roman glassware in China and Chinese silk in Rome. But they only had a vague idea about the exact location and borders of the other empire due to the significant distance. Moreover, there are no signs of continuous diplomatic contacts. Yet records on both sides illustrate how this long-distance trade brought prosperity. In China, silk was a luxury product that was only accessible to the highest and wealthiest classes of society, starting with the imperial court. Its sale abroad at a very high price became a lucrative activity, especially for the state that tightly controlled the production. For the Romans, access to these Eastern goods began on a larger scale after the conquest of Egypt and Syria, particularly Egypt, which had trade connections with India. By the time of Augustus, at the start of the 1st century AD, there were up to 120 ships setting sail every year from Roman Egypt to India. They traveled along the coastline because ocean-going sailing was very limited and dangerous at the time. From the 1st century onward, a craze for silk developed in Rome. However, the Romans did not know how silk was made. They assumed it was obtained from a tree. Consequently, they were very far from being able to produce silk themselves. They later learned that the fiber came from a specific caterpillar, but didn't know how to replicate the production process. As a result, all of their silk had to be imported. A lot of this silk arrived by land, as we saw before. It was not sold directly by Chinese merchants. It was supplied by the Parthians, who had bought it in Central Asia. At least it was provided when intermittent wars with the Romans allowed it. Sometimes wars would cut the land supply, which only made silk more difficult to find and therefore more desirable and expensive. Alongside it arrived spices and perfumes that also became very sought-after luxury goods for wealthy Romans. Rome had products to export too, like silverware and glassware. However, their value was far less from truly matching the imports from Asia. Early on, this trade imbalance became a source of concern for authorities, as the difference had to be paid in gold. This created an outflow of gold to Asia. In reaction, authorities attempted to limit silk imports. The Roman Senate issued several edicts to condemn the wearing of silk on economic and moral grounds. Silk clothes were called decadent and immoral because they were very thin, much thinner and lighter than traditional Roman fabrics. The real concern, however, was this outflow of gold, and neither moral nor economic condemnations managed to halt the appetite for silk. The Chinese and the Romans were not the only ones to benefit. In between them, there were all these middlemen from India, Central Asia, and the Middle East who contributed to the functioning of their segment on the Silk Road by acquiring goods and transporting them forward, as well as selling them locally. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people lived from this trade, from porters to wealthy merchants who armed ships or organized caravans on land. Traveling in groups on land for safety and economies of scale was an ancient practice, but it became standard on the Silk Road. As soon as the Chinese began to impel the Silk Road to Central Asia, they dispatched caravans. With a regular flow of these caravans, accommodations and resting places became essential along the Silk Road, leading to the proliferation of specialized inns known as caravanserais. The word caravan derives from the Persian term caravan, while sarai denotes a palace or a building with enclosed courts. While traversing deserts or mountains, caravanners would simply camp in the open, with guards keeping watch at night. This was needed as the goods they transported could potentially attract bands of thieves. But when on other parts of the Silk Road, like the actual roads, or when they crossed cities, the caravanners required places to stay. These places of refuge were the caravanserais, which were often located along roads in the countryside or on the outskirts of cities. Caravanserais were enclosed to offer protection, along with providing access to water, food, space for animals like horses or camels, and dormitories for men. These establishments didn't originate with the Silk Road. They were already present in India and in the Persian Empire, but became increasingly common and appeared in new regions with the surge of caravans. During the Islamic period, which commenced several centuries after opening the Silk Road, caravanserais became a prevalent type of structure from Western China to North Africa. Urban caravanserais evolved into more than inns, often situated near the bazaar, the primary market. They became the hub for goods arrival and departure, providing economic activities including offering goods to buy or sell, job opportunities, and became integral to the city's daily life. The historic centers of many old cities across the Muslim world still reflects this past, from Fez in Morocco to Istanbul in Turkey or Cairo in Egypt. Typically, the caravanserai was a building with a square or rectangular outer wall and a single entrance, a porthole, wide enough to let large, heavy-laden beasts such as camels enter. The building was organized around a courtyard that opened up into the sky. Around the courtyard were animal stalls, rooms, and chambers designed to accommodate people, animals, and merchandise. Sometimes the more elaborate caravanserais provided hammams, or public baths. They also had shops where travelers could acquire needed equipment. Caravanserai structures during medieval times sometimes added more floors, who provided rental apartments for low-income inhabitants. From the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, both ends of the Silk Road experienced a long period of relative prosperity and stability. Trade flourished. However, as history unfolded, the two mighty empires of the East and the West confronted challenges. In China, the Han Dynasty, which had ruled over and unified the territory for the most part of 4 centuries, eventually collapsed, initiating a period of fragmentation into different states. This period in the 3rd century is known as the Three Kingdoms period. Looking back, the Han period is often considered a golden age for China. Despite its internal conflicts, warfare on the borders, and power shifts from one branch of the Han Dynasty to another at the beginning of the 1st century AD, it was an extended period of relative stability when classical Chinese culture could flourish. In the West, the Roman Empire, which had reached its peak in the 2nd century, entered a major crisis in the 3rd century. This crisis led to its fracture and increased pressures on its borders that it had a hard time defending. The Silk Road did not close, as it constituted a network with different routes, allowing it to adapt. However, its function was seriously disrupted due to the loss of control by states on the routes through Central Asia and around the Mediterranean. Finally, the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, disappearing as an end client. It would take centuries before Western Europe became a significant client again for sophisticated Chinese and Asian goods. What remained was the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, which was still formidable. The eastern half of the empire had not been ravaged by wars and invasions like in the West, and it even reconquered large parts of the Western Empire. It was at war with the successors of the Parthians in Persia, Sasanian Empire. The Sasanians controlled half of the Middle East, the other significant power in the region being Byzantium. However, due to their geographic positioning, they controlled all commercial routes that went through Iran. The demand for silk and other exotic products persisted in Byzantium. North of the Sasanians in West and Central Asia, a new major power had emerged: the Turkic Khaganate. This was a massive inland empire, essentially populated by various nomadic peoples who had been unified by a Turkic clan. Turkic peoples are a collection of diverse ethnic groups that originated from West and Central Asia. They were unified by language and cultural traits, but they are not a single ethnicity. They are distinct from modern Turks, but historically related. The Turkish population emerged from a mix of Turkic invaders with the locals who lived in Turkey during late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. This meant that by the 6th century AD, the Turkic Khaganate had expanded to cover a vast area, stretching from Mongolia in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. Despite its size, it was not densely populated, and culturally, it was a collection of different peoples, including the Sogdians from Central Asia that I mentioned before. Sogdian was one of the official languages of this Khaganate, along with Old Turkic, A khaganate is a term that refers to a chiefdom or a kingdom. It is typically used for the Turkic, Mongol, and Tatar populations of Asia who were ruled by a khan, or chief. With its vast territories connecting the east and west, the Turkic Khaganate was strategically placed to manage a significant portion of the overland route to and from China. This was especially true after the Chinese lost control of their possessions in Central Asia, following the fall of the Han Dynasty. In the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian II formed an alliance with the Turkic Khaganate against their common enemy, the Sasanians. He bypassed the Sasanians for the silk trade, dealing directly with the Sogdian merchants living in the Turkic Khaganate. However, the Byzantines accomplished more than just this. They managed to steal the secret of silk making. 50 years prior to this alliance, Emperor Justinian sent monks as spies along the Silk Road from Constantinople to China. These spies successfully procured silkworm eggs and brought them back to Constantinople. This allowed the Byzantines to start their own silk production. This became a profitable activity for the Eastern Roman Empire, which controlled the monopoly over silk production for centuries in the Mediterranean. This production was centered around Constantinople and northern Greece. Despite their efforts, they could not rival the Chinese in terms of quality. China already had thousands of years of experience in silk making at this point. The luxury of Chinese silk outclassed that of Byzantine silk, so it did not halt imports. Proof that the Silk Road was still operative during the late antiquity is the discovery of coins minted in Constantinople during the 6th century found in Chinese tombs. The story of Byzantium is one of a very long and slow decline, interspersed with periods of recovery and conquest, as well as collapse. However, during the 6th century, Byzantium was still in good shape and was expanding. The Chinese noticed that the Roman Empire had undergone changes. Though not fully aware of the specifics, they knew that the old Roman Empire, referred to as Qing, had been fractured or had changed capitals. They named the Byzantine Empire Fulan and recognized it as good end customers for silk, lacquer, and ceramics. Then came the 7th century, bringing significant changes to the Silk Road. Two major events happened. First, the rise of the Tang dynasty in China, which is considered a golden age. The Tang reunified China under their rule and reconquered the western regions, waging war against the Turkics and the Tibetans. They regained control over the Silk Road, as they commanded a substantial portion of the land route to the west. This allowed them to establish direct trade with the Sogdians in Central Asia and the Persian merchants. This control over regions far from the historical Chinese heartland is sometimes called Pax Sinica. Equivalent to the term Pax Romana, coined to signify the stability and peace contributed to the domination of the Roman Empire. There had been a first Pax Sinica under the Han, and the new one, the second one, under the Tang. Compared to previous periods, The Tang dynasty was more outward-looking. They encouraged commerce and welcomed foreigners to some of their cities. Furthermore, they extended their maritime influence. Chinese envoys had been navigating through the Indian Ocean to India for several centuries, and during the Tang dynasty, they extended their reach beyond India to the Persian Gulf and all of Africa. The other major change in the 7th century was the rise of Islam, which expanded rapidly from Arabia, primarily to the expense of Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire, the latter being the last pre-Islamic state in Iran. After the conquest, Iran was mostly converted to Islam. However, in return, Persian culture also strongly influenced the Muslim states of the Middle East. Far from destroying the Silk Road, all these changes reinforced it. After the destruction left by the conquest, the Islamic Caliphate was rebuilt and became a major trade partner with Central Asia and China. The Muslim conquest extended to Central Asia. In the 8th century, until it clashed with the Chinese and their westward expansion, a large battle occurred in 751, the Battle of the Talas, between the Abbasid Caliphate and its allies from the Tibetan Empire, and an army of the Tang. The Muslim side won the battle, but after that, trade resumed because it was advantageous for both sides. Though it is disputed, the consequences of this military clash could have been the further dissemination of Chinese technology and techniques to the West. The Abbasid took hundreds of prisoners of war who were taken to Abbasid territory and would have lived there using the crafts they knew, including silk weaving and paper making. This would have permitted the transfer of technology. Paper making was widespread in China, whereas in the Middle East and the Mediterranean world, the most common forms of support for writing were papyrus, with parchment as a high-end alternative. Parchment is animal skin. By the end of the 8th century, paper making spread throughout the Islamic world. The first paper mill was built in Baghdad in 794-795, and paper started to replace papyrus. It is uncertain whether the prisoners of the Battle of the Talas were responsible for the technology transfer or not, but one way or another, this particular trade was disseminated, imitating Chinese techniques. From the 8th to the 10th centuries, the Islamic world fractured into many states, often rivals. Despite this, the Silk Road entered a new golden age. It was still operated by people from Central Asia like the Sogdians and the Turkics, now converted to Islam for the majority of them, by the Persians, the Arabs, the Byzantines. There are plenty of signs of cultural exchange between East and West, especially in decorative arts. Muslim craftsmen were inspired by Chinese aesthetics and vice versa. Some Chinese ceramics, for example, emulated the kind of geometric and floral patterns from Islamic art. Byzantium had shrunk to Anatolia, that is to say, modern Turkey, and the south of the Balkans, but it was also an important contributor to the Silk Road, as an importer of Chinese crafts and an exporter of glassware and enamels. The maritime route in the Indian Ocean was flourishing due to the spice trade. Concurrently, in the West, Europe was beginning to re-emerge on the trade map. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe, once an active participant on the Silk Road that stretched as far as Rome, became significantly lesser involved. From the 5th century onward, the road culminated in the Levant and Constantinople, with very few exotic products reaching Western Europe. However, the kingdoms of Western Europe, emerging from the Dark Ages, rekindled their interest in spices and luxury products. This resurgence made fortunes for Italian cities like Venice and Genoa, and economically bolstered Byzantium, the natural gateway to the East for Europeans. Goods arriving in Constantinople or other ports of Byzantium were brought to Italy by Italian merchants, and from there they were re-exported to Western Europe. This trade was not only fraught with risks, such as interruptions from wars and threats from piracy, but was also extremely lucrative. It transformed economies and societies, much like it had for Central Asian nomadic peoples, Chinese craftsmen, and Muslim merchants in earlier times. It stimulated the production of crafts for export, introduced new products that altered tastes, led to the emergence of a wealthy merchant class, changed the lifestyles of the affluent who could afford foreign goods. Innovative savings and business management strategies. This interconnectedness with distant parts of the world sometimes had catastrophic consequences. A prime example of this is the spread of the Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that struck in the 14th century. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan overwhelmed China. The Mongol Empire then expanded swiftly to become the largest land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from China and Mongolia to the Middle East. The Mongol conquest was brutal and led to extensive loss of life and destruction, but it was followed by efficient administration. After more and more provinces were included within the Mongol Empire during its expansion in the 13th and 14th centuries, they became more interconnected and relatively spared from warfare. The Mongols favored trade not only for its economic advantages, but also as a way to unify their gigantic empire, which encompassed very diverse peoples. They protected and promoted the Silk Road, which had essentially become an internal trade axis, connecting their Chinese holdings in the East to their more recently conquered provinces in the Middle East. In China, Mongol rulers became emperors, establishing what is known as the Yuan dynasty. They reunified China and made it the economic heartland of their empire. Trade brought great prosperity to some Chinese and Central Asian cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. For a time, it also reinvigorated Arab cities like Baghdad, which had been devastated by the invasion. However, the empire served as a conduit for much more than goods. Pathogens could also travel across its vast reach. The bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium spread by fleas that lived on rats, also easily infected humans. It is generally believed that the bacterium took a secondary form during the pandemic that made it communicable through person-to-person contact. This bacterium is thought to have originally appeared in Central Asia, specifically in the Tian Shan Mountains on the border of modern China, Kyrgyzstan, about 2,600 years ago. From there, it spread on multiple occasions, leading to various ancient and medieval epidemics. However, the outbreak in the 14th century was on a completely different scale. It is supposed to have been introduced to Europe during a siege. The Genoese, who had acquired the port of Kaffa in Crimea and used it as a trading post, were directly linked to the trade activity with the East. The port was besieged by the Golden Horde, the Khanate that ruled over the northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire. The plague had traveled from Central Asia to Crimea along the Silk Road, and the Golden Horde soldiers were succumbing to it. Instead of retreating, the armies threw their bodies over the walls of Kaffa. Thus, the epidemic began in Kaffa too. From there, it most likely spread all around the Mediterranean, reaching Constantinople, then Italy, North Africa, and soon all of Europe. This dispersion was probably facilitated by fleas living on rats that travel on Genoese ships. For several years, the pandemic ravaged Europe and the Middle East, killing more than a third of the population. People had no understanding of how the disease spread. They realized that avoiding contact and closing world cities could help, and this measure saved many lives. But from 1346 to 1353, the disease advanced unchecked. This might have occurred without the Silk Road, and more broadly, without the existence of trade routes connecting Asia to Europe. However, the rapid and destructive spread was likely due to the intense activity of caravans and the movement of populations within the Mongol Empire, which had effectively transformed the Silk Road into a highway for pathogens. Before this happened in the 13th century, Western Europeans had begun to reinvest in and explore this trade connection with the Far East. Essentially, they were missionaries and merchants. The most famous among them was undoubtedly Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant and explorer who traveled by land. He was, however, not the first. His predecessors are lesser known because their accounts were less widely read, and they failed to make a significant impact in Western Europe. Notable individuals included William Robert, a Flemish missionary and explorer, Benedict of Poland, a Franciscan friar, Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, an Italian diplomat, and André of Longjumeau, a French missionary. All of these men journeyed to the heart of the Mongol Empire. Some were even received at the court of the Great Khan. They began to inform Europe about the customs, languages, and political situations in the Far East. Marco Polo, however, provided a particularly comprehensive and successful account. So, who was Marco Polo? Despite his fame, there are plenty of unknowns about his life. We know he was born around 1254 in Venice into a family of merchants. His father and his uncle were traveling merchants who entered the business together before Marco was born. Like other Venetian merchants, they established trading posts in different locations, including at least one in Constantinople and another in Crimea. At the time, Venetian and general merchants followed this route. They employed individuals who would manage day-to-day activities like receiving shipments from other trading posts, buying and selling goods, maintaining records, and looking for opportunities. The job of creating and maintaining this network involved regular travel and exploration. His father and uncle were particularly enterprising because while Marco was still a child, they followed the Silk Road all the way to the Far East and met with the Mongol Emperor of China, Kublai Khan. They were among the handful of Western Europeans who traveled to China by land in the 13th century. They returned safely to Venice in 1269 when Marco was 15. They had been absent for so long that Marco had yet to meet his father. His mother had passed away, so he was raised by an aunt and another uncle. He received a comprehensive education geared towards becoming a merchant like his family members, learning subjects such as cargo ship operation, foreign currency handling, and business conduct. He presumably built a strong relationship with his father and uncle, because 2 years later, at the age of 17, he embarked on a new journey to Asia with them, a journey that would last 24 years. This trip turned out to be quite eventful. The experiences from this journey were later published in a book called The Travels of Marco Polo. This book was widely read beyond Venice, which popularized Marco Polo. This is why his name overshadowed all other European travelers of the Middle Ages to China. However, it wasn't just due to a successful book. His adventures were extraordinary. Along with his father and uncle, they traveled along the Silk Road all the way to China, where they were received for the second time by Kublai Khan. The Khan took a liking to Marco, supposedly because of his intelligence. He appointed him as one of his foreign emissaries. As the envoy of the great Khan and Emperor of China, Marco Polo was sent on many diplomatic missions. The role that had not been held by any other European gave him an opportunity to travel across China and Southeast Asia to India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. For 17 years, Marco stayed in Asia, serving as a special envoy or a high-ranking official. Around 1291, when Marco was 37 and had spent more than half his life in Asia, he was sent to Persia to accompany a princess, along with his aging father and uncle, who were still alive and had also stayed with him in China. They arrived in Persia in 1293, went on to Constantinople, and finally returned to Venice after 24 years. Marco would have settled in Venice and finally become a merchant, but not yet, because Venice and Genoa were at war. He joined the war effort and was captured by the Genoans. He could have been executed or died in a cell, but fortunately, he ended up in a prison in Genoa with a cellmate, who was also a writer. He dictated his stories to him, and the two co-authored The Travels of Marco Polo. Finally, he was released in 1299, then aged 45. This time, he could return for good to Venice, where he married, had 3 children, and built a fortune for himself, becoming a wealthy merchant. He died there in 1324 at the age of 70. His book became a medieval bestseller, but it was met with skepticism. It sounded a bit too extraordinary to be true. His account was quite different from others who had described the Mongols as barbarians, whereas he presented Chinese civilization and Mongol rule as prosperous and refined, shedding them in a positive light. They did not all have the same experience and saw the same things, which could explain some of these differences. It is also likely that Marco Polo's narrative was embellished, but since then, many details have been proven true and lend credibility to his account. It did not contain gross geographical errors like other accounts. His description of cities, customs, currencies used, and clothing were all proven accurate when compared to archaeological discoveries and Chinese records. Many of his embassies, including the last one when he accompanied a Mongol princess to Persia, were proven to be real. So there were probably exaggerations or embellishments here and there, but he provided the most accurate reports among these European travelers of the Middle Ages. And his book had the most insight because he rose high in Chinese society and stayed there for a long time. The Mongol Empire continued in the 14th century, but then fragmented and declined. The Yuan dynasty in China lost its grip on the country, and the new Chinese dynasty, soon the Ming, replaced it. For the Silk Road, this decline of the Mongols was bad. It had functioned for decades with the Mongolian Empire, for the most part, but its fragmentation separated different states along the Silk Road and made it more difficult and dangerous. In the west, Byzantium was now agonizing and had lost most of Anatolia. Turkey to the Turkic invaders, the Turkmens, and the devastation of the Black Death along the Silk Road had decimated the nomads and cities that lived off of it. Overall, after the collapse of the Mongol Empire, nomadic groups in Central Asia declined significantly. Regional sedentary states emerged instead. So in the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Silk Road declined with them. There was little interest from the Ming dynasty in China to propel it again. The Ming had a very inward-looking policy, and they discouraged contact with foreigners. The land route across Central Asia was more dangerous, and on the western end of the Silk Road, the Ottoman Empire was rising, eventually cutting Western Europe off from the Eastern trade. This was a significant setback for Italian city-states like Venice. Caravan trade across Asia did not disappear, but it never regained its previous dominance. During the times of Rome and the Han, or the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang, or under Mongol control, the significance of the route had been very different. On the maritime route in the Indian Ocean, spices had largely replaced Chinese goods. Consequently, the Silk Road did not close, but became increasingly less relevant. For over 1,500 years, it had been the most important access for world trade, but it was about to be supplanted by more challenging routes and different players. By the end of the 15th century, European explorers had reached America, traversed south of Africa into the Indian Ocean, and soon made their way to Asia unaided. First came the Portuguese from the east, then the Spanish across the Pacific from the west, and they were followed by the Dutch, the French, and the English. These nations reorganized world trade to their profit by sailing directly to India and China, buying the goods they desired without having to rely on any intermediaries, the middlemen who had thrived along the Silk Road for centuries. This is how the Silk Road slowly disappeared, leaving behind watchtowers and ruins, abandoned fortresses, and caravanserais in the wilderness, besides roads that had teemed with caravans for centuries and were now primarily used by locals. Consequently, the centers of world trade shifted to Europe for a few centuries, with cities like Lisbon, Seville, Amsterdam, and London benefiting the most. Apart from facilitating long-term cultural exchange, the Silk Road is important in its role as a first step in the globalization process, providing a connection between two of the furthest separated points in the known world. Its disappearance had major consequences. It was not the sole reason, but the vanishing of the Silk Road contributed to the Europeans' motivation to seek alternative routes to the Far East during the age of exploration and discovery. Without Chinese silk and porcelain and Asian spices, it remains uncertain what the Portuguese and the Spanish would have sent expeditions across the globe when they did. The history of the world could have been very different under different circumstances. More than 2,000 years ago, the Romans captured, sacked, and completely demolished the city that had once threatened their very existence, Carthage. After many battles over more than a century, the last Phoenician bastion in the world was no more, and a page of history was turned. In modern Tunisia, and it had been one of the largest, most advanced, and most influential cities of the ancient world. But its history had started far from the shores of Tunisia, and long before Rome even existed. Far to the east, in the Levant, this is the page of history we are going to explore tonight. You certainly have heard of Phoenicia, an ancient civilization from the Middle East oriented towards the sea that dominated trade in this part of the world 3,000 years ago and founded colonies all around the Mediterranean Sea, including Carthage. The Phoenicians hold many mysteries. For a long time, they were considered almost a lost civilization because of relative lack of written records about them. We will see why. And that's a paradox because the Phoenicians made many contributions to the advancement of culture and techniques. They had the world's oldest known alphabet. They did not invent writing, but as far as we know, they were some of the first to write words made of letters, as opposed to writing systems based on ideograms, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs, for example. They influenced the Hebrew, Arabic, and Greek alphabets, and in turn, the Latin alphabet that we use all the time. But this is just one thing among many others we will discuss tonight. I will also tell you about their origins, their culture, their religion, how ancient trade worked, the founding of cities and colonies, and of course, the Epic of Carthage. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries. as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax too. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now it's time to explore. Let's begin our journey to the past, shall we? Around the 12th century BC, more than 3,000 years ago, in the Middle East, Southeast Europe, and North Africa, there was a time of economic, political, and urban collapse. For several powerful and ancient cultures, this sudden change is called the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it affected different civilizations simultaneously. Some survived, but were greatly weakened, like Egypt and its new kingdom, or the Assyrian Empire from Mesopotamia. Others collapsed, like the empire of the Hittites from Anatolia and Levant and modern Turkey and Syria. In Greece, the ancient culture called Mycenaean Greece, which I've discussed in other stories, was also severely affected. Large cities and towns that were the centers of the economy declined dramatically, and life became organized around small, isolated villages. This lasted for several centuries, a period that has been called the Greek Dark Ages, before Greece began its cultural rebirth. It built its cities and developed the classical culture that made it so influential. The reasons for this late Bronze Age collapse are not well understood. There are multiple possible explanations, including volcanic eruptions, droughts, changes in military technology, as ironworking would have begun to appear at this time, possible invasions or migrations, most probably wars, and maybe a combination of these different factors. What we know is that suddenly, over 3 or 4 decades, states and cultures that were flourishing in this part of the world all declined simultaneously. I am telling you this because even though the late Bronze Age collapse was a leap backward, it was also a transition phase, and new cultures or peoples emerged from it, either because they were liberated from others' dominance, or they were better adapted to the new times that were beginning. This was the case with the Phoenicians, as the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Anatolians, and the Greeks that surrounded their region of origin were losing their political structures and becoming unable to project their influence, culture, trade, or armies. The Phoenicians rose to prominence for about 1,000 years, with periods of expansion and decline. Their maritime network spread all around the Mediterranean Sea, making them some of the most skilled and wealthiest merchants and mariners of antiquity. So it is during the 12th century BC that the Phoenicians emerged as an advanced independent civilization and original society. They benefited from the decline of their neighbors, but they were there long before, in a coastal region centered on modern Lebanon. extending to Israel and Palestine to the south, and Syria to the north. The Phoenicians belonged to a group of people called Canaanites, the people that lived in Canaan, a term familiar to readers of the Bible. But what is Canaan exactly? Canaan was both the name of a region that corresponds to the Levant, that is to say, the stretch of land or land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. The term Levant was defined in Europe during the Middle Ages to name a region with imprecise limits to the east. It literally means where the sun rises. There was a time when the term included Egypt, Turkey, or even Greece. But in the past couple of centuries, or in archaeology, its definition was limited to the stretch of land between Egypt and Turkey. In Arabic, there is a similar term, al-Mashriq, meaning the eastern place where the sun rises. But the definition of al-Mashriq is wider. It encompasses the entire Arab Middle East, the eastern part of the Arab world. So Canaan, as it appears in the Bible, corresponds to the southern Levant that provides the main setting of biblical narratives. The land of Israel, Philistia, a confederation of cities, and Phoenicia. The term Canaanite, to name the inhabitants of Canaan, is a catch-all term, as it was not a single country, not even a single ethnic group. For example, it is believed that the Philistines were a people of Indo-European origin that had similarities with the Mycenaean civilization of Greece. They arrived and settled at the time of the late Bronze Age collapse. But still, Canaanites are considered a relevant category because they populated the same region. There was a lot of overlap between populations. There were reciprocal cultural influences, and their languages belonged to the same family of Semitic languages. During the 2 or 3 centuries before the late Bronze Age collapse, Canaan, the southern Levant, became a region where the spheres of influence and powerful empires from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, the Hittites, converged and overlapped. They all fought for it, first because they wanted to expand and secure their frontiers. Second, because Canaan was a crossroads that gave access to trade with other regions, and also because of its resources. In particular, what is modern Lebanon and would be called Phoenicia had forests that could provide logs and timber for shipbuilding, monuments, and palaces. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians lacked this resource, whereas Phoenicia had plenty of native cedar wood that was highly sought after. So they would try to secure trade with cities of Phoenicia that could sell timber, or even better, submit them. In the 15th century BC, these cities were under Egyptian influence. The cities were independent from one another, and the largest and most influential at the time was Byblos, but there was also Sidon, Tyre, and Beirut, which made them easier prey for foreign powers because they were very small states. In the 14th century BC, Hittites captured Phoenician cities, especially in the north, and Egypt lost its coastal holdings. But despite these recurrent wars in which they were at stake, Phoenician cities managed to prosper during this period. They processed and exported cedar wood. They could support large populations because they had a temperate climate and the land was fertile. They also leveraged their central position between powerful and wealthy empires to become centers of trade and crafts. Byblos, for example, became a center for bronze making. The region was nearing the Iron Age, but bronze was still by far the most used type of metal. The city received precious goods, such as tin and lapis lazuli, that it transformed. And it managed to keep a degree of autonomy. It was not annexed by anyone. Other cities like Tyre and Sidon did the same. They were independent from one another and rivals. Despite being culturally very close, each one had its small territory. They actually never formed a single state. Then came the late Bronze Age collapse. That was disastrous for many civilizations in the region, but not for Phoenician cities. Quite the opposite, actually. Perhaps because they were small city-states. It was easier for them to stay united. Also, the weakening or disappearance of their neighbors left a vacuum that they could fill. They became the only maritime and mercantile powers in the region, a status they would maintain for several centuries. They also helped the Mediterranean economy recover in the 11th and 10th centuries BC, after the collapse. For example, they re-established long-distance trade between Mesopotamia and Egypt that had been lost. This period of emergence as an original and independent civilization is sometimes called the Phoenician Renaissance. But instead of staying in the corner of the Mediterranean Sea, Phoenician cities became more and more outward-looking. The collapse of all main powers in the east of the Mediterranean had left them with an opportunity to expand to the west as maritime and trade powers, and they used it. The creation of Carthage and many other settlements around the Mediterranean Sea would be a consequence of this. Before we talk about Phoenician expansion and the most successful of their colonies, Carthage, let's take a look at Phoenician society and religion. Politically, the Phoenicians were never united. They were independent city-states that rarely allied, as far as we know, and they were governed by hereditary kings. The kings were considered representatives of the gods and carried many obligations and duties concerning religious processions and rituals. In the high spheres of society, there were also classes of nobles and merchants. We don't exactly know how separated these classes were, whether they mixed or stayed very separated. Another powerful class was priesthood, which was apparently very influential. Of course, all these people accounted for only a small percentage of the population, maybe a few hundred per city-state, whereas the vast majority worked as farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, or sailors. Compared with other ancient societies, the Phoenicians had a very high proportion of mariners, and their economy was totally oriented towards the sea. and trade routes. From the moment they rose to prominence in the 12th and 11th centuries BC, they became the intermediaries between various peoples that spanned the Mediterranean Sea, further and further west, until they reached the Atlantic Ocean, Morocco, and Portugal. These distances were huge for antiquity, several thousand miles, and to travel such distances they needed good ships. In the 12th century BC, they already built large merchant ships. They were helped by an abundance of cedar wood, but they became expert shipbuilders and introduced types of ships and innovations that lasted throughout antiquity. For example, they developed the keel, the bottommost structural element on a vessel. It is a simple but very important element to stabilize ships when they travel on seas and not just follow the coastline. Centuries later, around 700 BC, they may have been the first to introduce the bireme, which is a type of galley with two superimposed rows of oars on each side. Biremes were long vessels that were used as warships because they could go faster and be less dependent on winds, making them perfect for attacking or escaping from other ships. They are also credited with later inventing the trireme, an even bigger, higher type of galley with 3 rows of oars. The Greeks copied these ships. They always had intense relations with the Phoenicians and actually began to compete with them on the sea when they recovered from the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. The Phoenicians also developed several other maritime inventions like the amphora. This type of container, generally made of ceramic with a pointed bottom, it was adopted by Mediterranean cultures because it was convenient to transport goods by sea or land, from wine to oil to fish. Amphoras could fit tightly against each other, tied together with rope. Amphoras became a standardized measurement of volume for a very long time, until the Middle Ages, 2,000 years later. The Phoenicians also contributed significantly to ancient cartography. They established some of the first maps that covered the entire Mediterranean world, so they acted as intermediaries, but also sold the goods they produced. It is a constant in ancient trade powers. Together with international trade, you always find a large production of crafts and luxury goods. The Greeks also did this. Much later, Venice, when it was a major trade power of the Middle Ages, was also a center of production of fine crafts. International trade always stimulated production of luxury or expensive goods with high commercial value. For the Phoenicians, there was glassmaking. They did not invent glass. Glass paste appeared centuries earlier in Mesopotamia and Egypt, but they became experts at making small glass objects like beads and flasks. At the time, glass was an expensive material. They also exported all sorts of metalwork and bronze, later iron and gold, and ivory carvings, woodwork. But the most prized Phoenician goods were fabrics, more specifically, fabrics dyed with Tyrian purple, named after the city of Tyre. The fortunes of Phoenician cities varied with time, I mentioned earlier that Byblos was probably the wealthiest and most influential. When Phoenicia was disputed, together with the rest of Canaan, between their powerful neighbors before the Bronze Age collapse. But after Byblos declined relatively, successively Sidon and Tyre rose to become the richest and most powerful city-states of Phoenicia. It was people from Tyre who founded Carthage when the city was at its peak of power in the 9th century BC. Tyrian purple, also known as Phoenician red or imperial purple, was very rare in fabrics and expensive in antiquity. It was costly because the Phoenicians had a monopoly on it, and the extraction process of the dye was very labor-intensive. It came from a particular type of marine snail, which used to be very common in coastal waters, but was exploited to extinction. Because it was expensive, hard to find, and not obtainable with any other kind of dye, this imperial purple color became a symbol of power and wealth in Greek, and even more so in Roman culture, and a major source of income for the Phoenicians in the first millennium BC. To complete this overview of the economy, the Phoenicians were also big producers of wine. They helped propagate its consumption all across the Mediterranean. They founded colonies near mines like in Cyprus, which had copper, and in Sardinia, and as far west as Spain, which in antiquity was a major source of metals for the Phoenicians and later the Romans. Spain had gold, iron, copper, tin, and lead. These colonies were generally small, most of the time no more than 1,000 inhabitants, and they worked as trading posts. The only exception, and it's a big one, would be Carthage. In general, the Phoenicians did not have the numbers or the intention to create a large empire with many territories. What motivated them when they created colonies was control of trade routes, proximity to places where resources could be extracted or sold, and increasingly, competition with Greek cities. Greece lost its first cities of the Mycenaean period following the late Bronze Age collapse. The population had declined, and people in Greece, after the collapse, started living essentially in small villages. But in the first millennium BC, the Greeks progressively re-emerged as an urban civilization, also organized politically around city-states like the Phoenicians, and also very outward-looking, willing to explore the Mediterranean and establish a presence everywhere. So in the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BC, there was rising competition between Greek and Phoenician cities to put their flag on every corner of the Mediterranean Sea where trade could be made, and dozens of colonies were founded. The Phoenicians had more in North Africa and Spain, the Greeks in Italy, but there were places like Sicily or Crete where they had settlements that sometimes clashed. Overall, coexistence between the Phoenicians and the Greeks was peaceful, but they became commercial rivals at the time. Like for Greek colonies, colonies of Phoenicia were fairly autonomous. Here again, there was no desire to create any kind of centralized empire, The colonies were seen as little sisters or daughters of the original city-state. These colonies were only expected, at most, to send an annual tribute to their mother city, and it was seen as a kind of religious offering. Again, Carthage, which we are going to talk about in a few minutes, became an exception. But before elaborating on Carthage, let's take a look at Phoenician religion. It is not very well known because few sources survived, and it is not always easy to distinguish Phoenician religious beliefs and traditions from their neighbors in Canaan. What we know is that the Phoenicians worshipped a pantheon that included a supreme god, El, E-L, common to various Semitic cultures. Another major deity was El's son, Baal, which meant master or lord. There were other deities like Melkart or Adonis, but we really don't know whether these were different names for the same gods or if they were different entities with different local names. The most important goddess was Astarte, sometimes called Ashtarte, which is how the ancient Greeks named her. This goddess was related to Ishtar from Mesopotamia. Because of its importance in the history of the Mediterranean, the Phoenician civilization is often studied primarily through the lens of trade, maritime activities, and the influence of Carthage. But the Phoenicians were also intensely religious. As I mentioned earlier, that their kings served as religious leaders, and priests held strong influence in society. Interestingly, there was no clear distinction between the payment of taxes and religious offerings. Both were seen as ways of honoring one's city and the divine in general. Phoenicians of all social classes made many votive offerings to their gods. A votive offering involved leaving an object in a sacred place, a temple, with no intention of recovering or using it later. This practice was widespread in ancient societies as a means of gaining favor with supernatural forces, and it continues in various religious practices today. These offerings often included objects like pottery vessels or small figurines, specifically crafted for religious purposes as votive offerings. Hundreds of such figurines have been discovered in Phoenician ports. It is believed that rituals were performed on ships before departure, during which figurines or other ceramics were cast into the sea to ensure safe travels. While not a common practice, it seems that child sacrifices did occur during times of despair or for certain ceremonies. This practice also existed among other Canaanite cultures and was one of the practices that were later severely condemned in both the Hebrew and then in the Christian Bibles. The high point, the peak of Phoenician cities in the Levant, was between 1200 and 800 BC, when they were independent and completely dominated trade. They did not disappear after that, and kept their culture and relevance in trade for several more centuries, but they started to be faced by the rise of new empires that they just didn't have the size and population to resist. and so they fell under the sway of foreign rulers who reduced their autonomy. In the 9th century BC, the Assyrians from Mesopotamia began to conquer Phoenicia, and they forced Phoenician cities to pay heavy tribute in money, goods, and natural resources like metals and wood. A century later, all cities except Byblos and Tyre were annexed by the Assyrians. Some cities revolted, but their rebellions were suppressed, and the Phoenicians never managed to fully recover their independence. The Assyrian Empire collapsed, but was quickly replaced by the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylonians also put Phoenician cities under their vassalage. When the Babylonian Empire crumbled due to the rise of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, the Phoenicians had lived under pressure from foreign powers for several centuries. Instead of revolting, they found agreements with Persians. They yielded themselves to Persia so they could pay tribute and provide the Persians with a powerful fleet in exchange for a high degree of autonomy. When Persia went to war with Greek cities in the 5th century BC, the Phoenicians provided most of the Persian fleet. Culturally, they kept their specificity for the entire Persian period until the 4th century BC. At this point, they were still relevant in trade, but were completely surrounded by Persian territories and faced tough competition from the Greeks. However, on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, the colony of Tyre, at the time the largest and wealthiest Phoenician city, had had an extraordinary development. It is time to talk about Carthage, an ancient city whose exact founding date remains uncertain, but was most likely established by the 9th century BC. This period marked the height of the Phoenician commercial dominance, though they faced pressure from the Assyrians, who forced them to pay tribute. This pressure accelerated the founding of more colonies around the Mediterranean Sea. Because many people from Sidon, Byblos, or Tyre, Carthage was a colony of Tyre, were willing to relocate to avoid paying heavy taxes to foreigners, Tyre had been particularly active in developing its commercial web in the western Mediterranean, especially in North Africa. At its western extent lay Iberia, modern Spain, and Portugal, with its valuable metal resources. And Tyre had established its presence on islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands. The site of Carthage was probably chosen for several strategic reasons. It was located on the central shore of the Gulf of Tunis, providing easy access to the sea while being shielded from violent storms common in this part of the Mediterranean Sea. Its proximity to the Strait of Sicily was strategically important, as any ship traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean had to pass near Sicily. Strait of Sicily is a bottleneck. On top of this good strategic allocation, this site offered numerous advantages. Built on a kind of peninsula with a large lagoon on one side, it provided abundant fish and a safe harbor. The peninsula connected to the mainland via a single narrow strip of land and featured defensive hills. The surrounding fertile land could support a large population. Due to its favorable location, intense trade activities, and because Carthage was about halfway between Spain and Phoenicia, near important islands like Sardinia and Sicily. And on top of that, the flow of Phoenicians willing to move to colonies, Carthage grew exponentially. Unlike other colonies that remained small, with just a few hundred inhabitants, Carthage's population grew from 0 to 30,000 people within a century during the 8th and the 7th centuries BC, a high number for the time. And meanwhile, its mother city Tyre declined in the 7th century, particularly due to wars with the Babylonians and multiple sieges. Carthage flourished, though its inhabitants maintained their Phoenician culture. They became so successful and independent that they began identifying as citizens of Carthage rather than Tyre. Unlike other colonies that relied primarily on trade, Carthage diversified its economy. It processed raw materials, produced crafts, generated substantial food supplies, and became a trade hub between Africa and the Mediterranean world. The city traded in luxury goods including ivory, ostrich eggs and feathers, gold, plenty of food, and wine. The Carthaginians developed a distinct Punic culture, with Punic being the Latin equivalent of the Greek term Phoenician. Punic culture is the name of this Western Phoenician culture that developed far from Phoenicia, particularly in religious practices. In Carthage, certain deities gained more prominence, and Greek gods like Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, were also incorporated into worship. It is also possible that Carthage retained Phoenician practices that had fallen out of favor entirely, like child sacrifices. This is uncertain. There is an ongoing historical debate about whether Carthaginians practiced child sacrifices. By the middle of the 7th century BC, Carthage had become largely independent from its mother city, which lacked either the means or the desire to maintain control. This independence was so complete that Carthage began its own colonization process. When Tyre and other Phoenician cities submitted to the Persian Empire in the 6th century BC, Carthage emerged as a formally independent power. What distinguished Carthage from other Phoenician cities was its broader ambitions. While maintaining the traditional Phoenician affinity for maritime trade, Carthage uniquely pursued imperial and military expansion. Unlike cities such as Byblos, Tyre, or Sidon, it engaged in territorial conquest. It became an expansionist power. The reasons for this distinctive path remain unclear, especially considering that nearby Utica, an older Phoenician colony with similar advantages, never pursued such expansion. Maybe it came down to a few influential individuals in Carthage, or events we don't know of. Several theories attempt to explain Carthage's exceptional development. One suggests that refugees from Phoenicia, fleeing Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, brought new perspectives on the vulnerabilities of the traditional Phoenician model of maritime power with minimal territory, and a small population was fragile and always at risk with large land empires as neighbors. The presence of Greek and Etruscan influence in the Western Mediterranean. They also had small states or city-states, but with larger territories than Phoenician states, and this may have threatened the Phoenician trade monopoly. And finally, domestic politics may have also played a crucial role. Very little is known from Carthaginian politics before the 3rd century, when wars with Rome began. In the 6th century BC, King Mago I, a general who developed Carthage's land army with regular soldiers and mercenaries, occupied the throne. His dynasty continued with this military policy. From the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, Carthage expanded significantly, but more importantly, annexing other Phoenician colonies and directly administering territories across North Africa from Morocco in the west to Libya in the east, plus Sardinia, Malta, the Balearic Islands, half of Sicily, and southern Spain. This territorial expansion inevitably led to increased interactions and conflicts with neighboring powers. In Italy, there was a young rising power at the time, the Roman Republic, which was expanding from central Italy. But the time of war had not arrived yet. In 509 BC, at the end of the 6th century, Carthage and Rome signed a treaty that demarcated their spheres of influence. The two states had different approaches to their expansion. The Carthaginians were still very oriented towards maritime control and trade, favoring the control of coastal regions, whereas Rome was more of a land power. The Romans wanted to exploit the mainland, and their navy was secondary to their army. These two different cultures and the heritage of Phoenicia influenced Carthage a great deal. This was also a product of necessity. The Romans had direct neighbors in the north and south of Italy that could threaten them, whereas the city of Carthage was not close to any enemy that could attack by land. So in the 5th and 4th centuries, Rome and Carthage avoided war, and each kept growing. But the one conflict that could not be avoided for Carthage was with the Greeks. The different Greek cities had many colonies in the Western Mediterranean, which put them in direct competition with Carthage. The biggest stake in this rivalry was Sicily, which was half Carthaginian in the west and half Greek in the east. The most important Greek city in Sicily was Syracuse, and in 480 BC, the tyrant, the ruler of Syracuse, Gelon I, also pronounced Gelon I, attempted to unite Sicily under his rule, obviously with the backing of other Greek city-states. The word tyrant in modern English is rather pejorative. It means a kind of cruel dictator. However, the original Greek term only meant absolute monarch, someone who ruled without constitutional power. For much of ancient Greece, it was just a neutral term, something factual. That changed later during classical Greece when several Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle defined a tyrant as a person who rules without law, using extreme and cruel measures. This is when the term began to become negative. But returning to 480 BC, the ruler of Syracuse launched his conquest of Sicily by attacking other Greek colonies. The threat to Carthaginian holdings in the west became quite obvious, prompting Carthage to intervene. An expedition was sent to Sicily, led by King Hamilcar, who came from the same dynasty as Mago, the king who had begun transforming the Carthaginian army. The expedition proved to be a significant failure for Carthage. Hamilcar lost part of his army en route to Sicily due to poor weather conditions. When the two armies finally met, the Greeks won a decisive victory, and Hamilcar perished. This created a power vacuum in Carthage, leading the city's nobles to sue for peace. After this war, Carthage was left with only a marginal presence on Sicily's coast. But the most significant consequence was a political turning point. Monarchy disappeared, and the elite of nobles and traders established an oligarchic republic in Carthage. This new model more closely resembled the Roman Republic, where assemblies of noble and common people had the power to constrain their rulers. Despite this major political change, it was merely a temporary setback for Carthage. The losses in Sicily were compensated by conquering more territories in Spain and North Africa. In the 5th century BC, Carthaginian navigators ventured beyond the Mediterranean Sea, passing through the Strait of Gibraltar between Europe and Africa. While they weren't the first to explore this region, which had been mapped for centuries, but they pushed further than their predecessors. To the north, they explored the Atlantic coast of Europe, and to the south, they traveled along the African coast as far south as Senegal. This was a remarkable achievement. For comparison, Spanish and Portuguese navigators of the Middle Ages would not venture so far south, and it wasn't until the 15th century, some 2,000 years later, that Portuguese explorers dared to match this feat. The Carthaginians never managed to reconquer all of Sicily. They attempted a second Sicilian War 70 years later, after the first one, and a century later there was a third. But these conflicts always ended in a stalemate. Despite all its wealth and undisputed control of the western Mediterranean Sea, a greater challenge was yet to come. The rising power of the Roman Republic to the north. By the beginning of the 3rd century BC, Rome had expanded significantly. It had secured its frontiers in northern Italy and gained territories towards the south. Rome was definitely an expansionist power, as was Carthage, and the western Mediterranean was not large enough for both powers. Carthage, the city, had reached an impressive size by this point. While the city had 30,000 inhabitants in the 7th century BC, By the 3rd century BC, 400 years later, it had grown to approximately 500,000 people. These are just estimates, but they give an order of magnitude. And these estimates suggest that Carthage was not only the largest city in the Mediterranean world at the time, but possibly in the entire world. Though few contemporary descriptions of the city exist, we know Carthage had powerful walls, palatial homes for wealthy traders and nobles, temples, probably public buildings like baths, and bustling markets throughout. The port was enormous. There are many descriptions of countless commercial vessels, probably hundreds, owned by the Carthaginians. They were renowned from Italy to Greece to even Phoenicia and the Middle East for their mercantile skills and wealth. But Carthage was not just a mercantile culture. It also had emphasized agriculture, which was less common in Phoenician culture. For miles around the city, there were numerous farms, orchards, and vineyards with large private estates, as described by travelers from Rome and Greek cities. The Carthaginians enjoyed a rich material culture, consuming both locally produced luxury goods and items from distant regions like the Middle East, Greece, and even sub-Saharan Africa on the other side of the Sahara. After losing the First Punic War with Rome, Carthage embraced agriculture and industry even more intensively to compensate for lost territories overseas. The war was triggered by Carthage's military intervention in Sicily, which led to Carthaginian forces being present in the Strait of Messina, the narrow channel between continental Italy and Sicily. This brought Carthage closer than ever to Roman interests on the Italian mainland, prompting an immediate Roman response, attacking the Carthaginians. This started the First Punic War, which is to say the first war between Rome and Carthage, which began in 264 BC, with both powers at their height. Carthage probably held advantages in naval power and wealth, while Rome possessed superior manpower and a well-organized, effective land army. The Carthaginians attempted to compensate for their military disadvantages by employing mercenaries. The First Punic War lasted for more than 20 years, though not of continuous battles. It took time to send expeditions. The Romans managed to land in Africa but were repelled, whereas Carthage had victories at sea. However, Carthage subsequently suffered a string of defeats that forced it to sue for peace. To make matters worse, it faced a large mutiny of its employed troops and uprisings in African settlements, resulting in a kind of civil war. When this ended, Carthage could stabilize its situation, though the city had a huge indemnity to pay to Rome. The Romans had used the events of this mercenary war to seize Corsica and Sardinia. The First War had temporarily weakened Carthage, but not destroyed it. The city rebuilt what had been destroyed and restored its wealth. Even though Rome had gained some ground, the dispute was far from settled. 20 years of armed peace followed, but clearly one of the two powers needed to go. Animosity grew on both sides, and in 218 BC, a second Punic War started, lasting 17 years. This became the most famous of the Punic Wars because it saw spectacular action and threatened Rome's very existence. At the war's start, the Romans controlled Italy, Sardinia, and Corsica, and had reinforced their navy. The Carthaginians held Iberia, Spain, as their main pool of manpower. Their army was very diverse, comprising various North African peoples, Spaniards, ethnic Phoenicians, and a large cavalry composed largely of Numidians, people from what is now eastern Algeria. Renowned for their horsemanship, the Carthaginians also employed North African elephants, which went extinct during antiquity, as assault units and for their psychological impact on infantry. They were terrifying to infantrymen who made the bulk of ancient armies. The most famous episode of this war was the surprise journey of the Carthaginian commander-in-chief, Hannibal, who led an army of tens of thousands by land from Spain to Italy, crossing the Alps in a seemingly impossible feat for such a large army and its elephants. Entering northern Italy with Gaulish allies, Hannibal won several victories against the Romans, including one of antiquity's largest battles, the Battle of Cannae, where the Romans were crushed despite superior numbers. When they saw this, several Roman allies subsequently switched allegiance to Carthage. Hannibal was in Italy, and the situation appeared critical for Rome. It wasn't entirely favorable for him either. His army suffered from attrition as time passed, and the war in Italy lasted a decade, during which the Romans refused to concede, instead utilizing their large manpower pool to field even more armies. The Romans demonstrated superior siegecraft capabilities, allowing them to recapture cities more quickly than Hannibal could take them. While managing to contain Hannibal in Italy more or less, they simultaneously dispatched an expedition led by General Scipio Africanus to Spain, effectively ending Carthaginian control there. The final confrontation occurred near Carthage at the Battle of Zama, where the Romans, again led by Scipio, defeated the Carthaginians decisively. The war was lost for Carthage. The Romans imposed harsh peace terms on Carthage for two reasons. Their intention was always to eliminate Carthage as a great power, and second, for retribution for the major devastation caused in Italy. And there had been a time, a few years earlier, before the victory, when the Romans could have been completely destroyed. Had Hannibal succeeded in taking Rome, Carthage might have entered another period of expansion, potentially preventing the rise of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire may have never existed. It is impossible to know. But in any case, Rome's victory established it as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, gaining all Carthaginian possessions, especially Spain, while Carthage was reduced to a virtual Roman client state, with only its North African territory. Though Carthage remains a large city after the Second Punic War, it had lost the foundations of its prosperity, its commercial network, its navy, which had been confiscated, and manpower was all gone. 50 years later, the Third Punic War saw Rome finally destroy Carthage. This conflict was driven by hawkish Roman senators seeking political and imperial gains, with Carthage's fertile agricultural lands in North Africa presenting an attractive target. There was still wealth to seize, and it was a profitable but low-risk operation for Rome. In 146 BC, using Carthage's conflict with Numidia as a pretext, Rome intervened in support of its ally, in reality to besiege and completely destroy the ghost of the biggest threat to Rome that had ever existed. We had left Phoenicia in the eastern Mediterranean when Persia had annexed the various cities or subjugated them. Phoenicia's fate had been sealed earlier, though Phoenician cities maintained their culture and commercial power under the Persian rule, but their independence ended permanently. After the Persians came Alexander the Great by the Greeks, and Phoenicia was one of the first regions he conquered. In Alexander's empire, and later its successor in Lebanon and Syria, the Seleucid Empire, Phoenician culture increasingly merged with Greek traditions. The arrival of Romans in the 1st century transformed the region into a province, where Phoenician culture gradually dissolved through Romanization, to the point of going extinct and no longer distinguishable. The province remained part of the Roman Empire for centuries, first under Rome proper and later under the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. During this period, the old region gave way to Christianity until the Muslim Arab invasion in the 7th century initiated a process of Islamization and Arabization. By then, the Phoenician civilization, despite its centuries of being masters of the sea and leaving significant contributions to human civilization, had long disappeared. By the end of the 8th century, as medieval Europe was slowly emerging from the Dark Ages, people from the north by sea began to unexpectedly launch raids against coastal towns and villages around the Baltic Sea and North Sea. Within a few decades, they ventured further, adventuring as far south as Spain, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, and as far east as the Volga River. In some regions, they attacked and looted, disappearing as fast as they had arrived. In other regions, they settled and explored, from the vast steppes of what would become Russia to the cold waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, all the way to Iceland, Greenland, and America. These people were Norsemen, that we also call Vikings. We will examine where the term Viking originates from. European chronicles of the time depicted these Norsemen with a mixture of fear and condemnation, because they were looters and merciless warriors. They were also pagans, at a time when many of the regions they attacked were populated by Christians. The fear of the Norsemen only receded in the 11th century, as they had settled and assimilated in regions beyond their cradle in Scandinavia and progressively Christianized. How Europeans came into contact with the Norsemen during the Middle Ages strongly influenced historiography for a long time. Indeed, centuries later, they were seen as mere barbarians until the beginning of a revival in the 18th and 19th centuries. This revival sparked interest in their culture and made non-Scandinavians realize that the Norsemen had an original culture that had formed long before the Middle Ages. This revival period also birthed new stereotypes or myths about the Vikings, stereotypes that remain prevalent today. I will tell you just a little bit about that too, but just to give you an anecdote, an example, they are often depicted with horned helmets, which is a 19th century invention. There is no trace of such helmets in contemporary descriptions or archaeological remains. The persistent image of the Norsemen as predominantly violent warriors is also a narrow portrayal. No society can sustain itself solely through warfare. The Norsemen were also farmers, fishermen, hunters, and craftsmen, and constituted a complex society. The majority of them remained in Scandinavia, in what is now Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. So tonight we're going to take a look at the history, the culture, and the societies of the Norsemen, where they came from and why they suddenly expanded out of Scandinavia, how this changed the world and left a trace from Russia to Normandy and Great Britain. This is going to be an overview of the Viking Age. I also made a story about Norse mythology, if you are interested in their myths and pantheon, which you can find on my channel. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath. And when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. And make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now it's time to explore. The story begins over 1,200 years ago, when Viking ships' sails started to multiply in the Baltic and the North Sea. Traditionally, the start of the Viking Age is dated to 793 AD, when an attack occurred against the Abbey of Lindisfarne in England. At the time, this abbey was an important center of learning, and possibly dozens of monks resided there. It was located off the coast of northern England, near the border with Scotland. The monks were either cast into the sea or taken away as slaves. The abbey was looted, and the Norsemen disappeared. This year, 793, was chosen as the start because this attack was impactful. But it wasn't necessarily the very first one. Archaeological findings indicate that there were contacts as early as the 8th century between Scandinavia and Great Britain. This was also true for the southern shores of the Baltic Sea, which were close to Scandinavia, which today is Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. These raids only intensified in the subsequent decades and into new regions. Throughout the ninth century, the Viking scare spread to many coastal regions of Europe and even inland. This was possible because the Norsemen also sailed rivers on their ships and could attack settlements dozens of miles away from the sea. But who exactly were these warriors? What were they seeking, and why had they started to venture out of Scandinavia? The Norsemen, or Norse people, had settled in Scandinavia centuries earlier as a branch of Germanic peoples, thriving alongside the Celts, Greeks, Italic peoples, and many others. They were part of the Indo-European peoples that migrated in successive waves from the steppes of Eurasia, starting thousands of years ago. The Indo-Europeans had a strong influence in the regions where they arrived, often mixing with local populations. Though we do not know definitively how peaceful these interactions were, but they happened. It is clear they brought culturally dominant traits to their new homelands. Their various languages, belief systems, and social organizations, influenced by varying factors such as geography, climate, history, and local culture. These peoples formed diverse cultures throughout the second and first millennia BC. Their languages diverged in a complex process involving multiple migrations in different directions, often encountering other Indo-European peoples and mixing with them. The nuances of these migrations and interactions remain somewhat elusive. However, what we do know is that around 2,000 years ago, the Nordic peoples occupying the Scandinavian peninsula had acquired enough cultural specificity to form a common cultural area. Why consider them as a single cultural entity? Apart from similar social structures and customs, they also spoke the same language, Proto-Norse, the ancestor of Old Norse, the language that replaced it later around the 8th century. During the Viking Age, Old Norse was in use and later became in turn the precursor to the different languages spoken today by the Swedes, the Danes, or the Norwegians. These three languages share many words and structures because of their common origin. So the Norsemen were at the same time an ethnic group descending from Indo-Europeans and the local prehistoric population of Scandinavia, and they were also a linguistic group. They spoke the same language. However, this linguistic unity did not imply political unity. For instance, in the 9th century, the largest Norse state was probably in Denmark, but it barely covered half of modern Denmark and was primarily centered on the Jutland Peninsula, the part of Denmark that is connected to the continent. At the same time, in Norway, it is estimated that up to 30 different small kingdoms existed, a likely consequence of its geographically diverse terrain that created natural boundaries. In terms of technology, 8th and 9th century Scandinavia was on par with Western and Northern Europe. We see it in their metalwork, the houses they built, their crafts. But there is one field in which the Norsemen held a significant advantage: sailing technology. and this is what made their seafaring and raids possible in the first place. These developments included the use of larger sails and navigation techniques such as tacking, where the bow of a ship is turned towards and through the wind, thereby changing the wind's direction from one side of the boat to the other, enabling progress toward a destination into the wind. Without this technique, sailing into the wind in a straight line would be impossible. The Norse were skilled sailors along with long tradition of shipbuilding, especially the construction of longships, sometimes also referred to as drakars. The longship design evolved for a long time. The oldest one found traces back to the oldest archaeological findings dating from the 4th century BC, over 1,000 years before the Viking era. Logically, the Norse were driven to the sea for trade, travel, or war. Since the fields of Norway or the islands of Denmark, the sea offered the fastest and most accessible route. Norse longships were made of wool and equipped with woven wool cloth for sails. An advantage of these ships was their combination of being relatively light and robustly stable. They could operate in seas and oceans as well as on rivers, making them ideal for raids. They could carry a few dozen men, continue to function in all weather, barring severe storms, and because they possessed large sails, they could also be propelled by rowers, making them highly adaptable. These ships had a shallow draft and could navigate waters only 1 meter deep, only a few feet deep, making their landing on almost any beach possible. Their lightness allowed them to be carried quickly out of the water for protection, and at times to be used upside down as shelters. There were various types of longships, some small, and the drakar, dragon, were the large ones, with 30 or more rowing benches. In Norse sagas, the stories and histories written in the Middle Ages, there were accounts of spectacular drakars, but their reality is uncertain due to the lack of archaeological evidence or proof of existence. However, irrespective of whether such super long ships ever existed, it can be said definitively that around the Viking Age, the Norse certainly possessed the best ships in Europe. Without them, it's unlikely they could have traveled so far from Scandinavia. Why did they decide to expand or explore like this in the 8th century after so many centuries of staying on their own lands? What are the causes of this Norse expansion? It was probably a combination of reasons. One could have been what I just told you about their sailing technology. The innovations they introduced made these long-distance raids possible, and they did them because they could. But there were other contributing factors. Another one could have been political. In the decades before the Viking Age in Scandinavia, the very decentralized political organization that had prevailed for centuries began to change. Larger kingdoms emerged in Sweden, in Denmark, and even in Norway, despite its challenging geography. These new states expanded and grew at the expense of many independent chieftains who were forced out of their own lands. If they refused to submit, they needed to find refuge or resources elsewhere. This could have motivated many of them to start raiding Western Europe, the British Isles, or to start exploring new lands as the only possibility to remain independent. In Western Europe, they found states that were very decentralized and weak, without navies capable of opposing them, or land armies that could resist their attacks. Additionally, there were many isolated religious sites, abbeys, and monasteries that were defenseless. So the politics and state organization in the 8th century could have been a significant factor. At the same time, Viking raiders were pushed out of Scandinavia and drawn towards the rest of Europe due to attractive and easily attacked targets. Yet another factor could be demography. During the 8th century, there might have been a demographic boom in Scandinavia, and the lack of agricultural capacity would have made it necessary to search for lands beyond their ancestral territories. Now, this explanation, which is often used as a hypothesis to explain migrations, is a bit uncertain or controversial, because there is no proof that a demographic boom ever happened in the decades before the start of the Viking Age. It is a possible explanation, but it could also just be a cliché. Realistically, it is difficult to know how many inhabitants there were at that time in Scandinavia. One estimate I found of population in European countries around the year 1000 suggests a number between 1 and 1.5 million. 500,000 in Denmark, 400,000 in Sweden, and 200,000 in Norway. For comparison, at the same time, the whole of Great Britain would have had about 2 million inhabitants. Italy had 7 million, Germany 5 to 6 million, and France 9 million. It's true that Scandinavia did not have vast expanses of fertile land, but it was still relatively sparsely populated. A Norse kingdom with a few thousand or tens of thousands of subjects would have been already quite large, because they weren't many in number. The Vikings always operated in small groups rather than large armies, except in very particular cases. They couldn't assemble armies of several thousand, making the demographic explanation uncertain. Another factor that seems probable is the economic explanation. The 8th century saw increased prosperity around Western Europe and the Mediterranean following the desegregation of the Western Roman Empire. Europe had fallen into a long period of demographic and economic decline. This period, called the Dark Ages, saw the collapse of trade in the 5th century, when regions connected by roads and the same administration became isolated. Out of these ruins, a new society organized around local chieftains and lords gradually formed over several centuries, a feudal-type society that would reach its final form later in the Middle Ages. In the 7th and 8th centuries, this transformation was taking place, and many communities, villages, or chiefdoms still lived in an almost autarkic economy. They survived on the food they produced and traded very little with the rest of the world. Large cities had almost disappeared from Western Europe, and most of the population lived in hamlets and villages, or occasionally small towns. Christian monasteries had grown, either near villages or in isolated areas. Standards of living and general wealth were still well below what they once had been under the Roman administration. But in the 8th century, there was a modest yet real improvement. Some towns, even new towns, grew. Some monasteries became more prosperous, owning the land they exploited. An example of this in Anglo-Saxon England at the time is the development of towns functioning as emporiums, settlements, with significant trade and artisanal activity. Don't imagine something substantial, at most a few hundred inhabitants, but compared with previous centuries, the movement towards concentration of wealth was beginning. These places became attractive targets to sack. Before the Viking Age, there were occasional trade connections between Scandinavia and these towns, so the Norse were aware of their existence. They could probably notice that their prosperity had increased. Farther south in the Mediterranean Sea, the Islamic world had also consolidated following its swift expansion, and this helped push trade routes and a bit of wealth further and further north. The Vikings also noticed this, and later they would venture to Spain and North Africa, which were under Muslim control at the time. The economic appeal of regions to the south of Scandinavia could have been a factor. Finally, one last hypothesis about the initiation of the Viking Age is an ideological or religious factor. By the late 8th century, Christianity continued to expand northwards and eastwards through a mix of conversions of pagan populations and wars. For example, in the year 772, so that's 20 years before the attack on the Abbey of Lindisfarne, marking the beginning of the Viking Age, Christian Emperor Charlemagne, who ruled over France, northern Italy, and the west of Germany, launched a campaign against pagans, the Saxons in Germany, including their conversion forcefully over the following decades. So the pagan world was shrinking, and occasionally missionaries would travel to Scandinavia trying to spread their faith. Here again, this is hypothetical, and we like elements of proof. But the beginning of the raids could have also been a response to the perceived threat, or the threat could have justified them. That makes a lot of factors behind the triggering of the Viking Age: technological, demographic, economic, political, and possibly ideological. Likely it was a combination of these that explains the sudden interest in expansion. It was not a decision taken by a particular state or a council of Norse people. Instead, it was a broad movement that an entire cultural and ethnic group got invested into. Now let's examine how things unfolded as the Norsemen became increasingly adventurous. Up until around 830 AD, Viking raids mostly targeted Ireland, while occasionally conducting attacks against England or the northern part of Charlemagne's empire. Ireland was a choice target because it was less defended than England and the Carolingian Empire. Within the empire of Charlemagne, the Vikings risked encountering a garrison, troops, that would oppose them. Following the year 830, the Carolingian Empire fractured due to the laws of the Franks regarding succession. These laws did not permit the firstborn son to inherit everything. Instead, the inheritance was divided between all the sons. So even a successful kingdom or empire, such as Charlemagne's, would not survive the death of the ruler if he had multiple sons. This led to a politically unstable map of Western Europe, ultimately resulting in the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire. Concurrently, the Vikings launched larger raids with multiple ships, leaving England almost defenseless. From the year 830 onward, the Norse found it almost too easy to conduct their raids, sometimes choosing to stay and establish bases, mainly in the 9th century on the coasts of England and Scotland, and in the 10th century in France, the region known today as Normandy. They could travel deep inland via the Seine River and attack cities like Paris, establishing territories such as Yorkshire in England and Normandy in France, effectively transforming these regions into Viking colonies. At the time, in France, there was little hope of expelling the Vikings soon. So the Frankish king of West Francia, the western part of Charlemagne's empire that later became the Kingdom of France, King Charles the Simple, challenged the situation and dealt with the Norse. He negotiated with the Viking leader Rollo, a chieftain of uncertain Danish or Norwegian origin. The king granted Rollo the title of Duke of Normandy and full rights over this fertile and strategically located land at the crossroads of northern and southern Europe, facing Great Britain. In return, Rollo swore loyalty to King Charles the Simple, which made him one of the main lords of the kingdom. Rollo vowed to defend the kingdom from further Viking attacks. This agreement took place at the beginning of the 10th century, in the year 911. The Normans, now established in Normandy, began to assimilate local culture. They converted to Christianity and over a few generations transitioned from Old Norse to the Norman language, which was a Romance dialect of French. These assimilated Normans prospered substantially, and their descendants retained their adventurous spirit. They served as mercenaries across Europe, especially in southern Italy, where they even managed to establish fiefdoms. And in England, the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, invaded Western Europe in the 11th century. But Western Europe was not the only region in which the Norsemen showed interest. Most attacks in Western Europe were carried out by Norsemen from Denmark, and to a lesser extent from Norway. However, the Norwegians also explored the Atlantic and colonized different islands, the Shetlands, north of Scotland, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, which they reached in 982, and even made it all the way to Vinland in America. This American colony, known as Vinland, was traditionally only known through the sagas and medieval historiography. Thus, historians had reservations about whether the Norsemen had actually reached America. Those reservations were put to rest in 1960, when evidence of a Norse site was discovered on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in Canada. This proved that the Norse had crossed the Atlantic centuries before Christopher Columbus, Although only one Norse colony was found in America, it is possible that others existed but did not prosper. Their colony faded or they all left at an unspecified time, and there is no trace of further exploration inland in Canada. The Norse who lived in Sweden looked more towards the Baltic coastline and to the east, towards what would become Russia. They had a significant impact on these regions. Norsemen who settled or traveled to the east are also referred to as Varangians. They contributed in shaping the history of Russia and Ukraine. In 859, a chieftain named Rurik from the Rus tribe is believed to have conquered or was invited to reign in Novgorod in the north of western Russia. I say believed because Rurik is a semi-legendary figure. Whether he existed or not is uncertain. His name only appeared in chronicles 2 centuries later. However, it is certain that this region of northwestern Russia fell politically to the Norse. From there, the Norse traveled further south to Ukraine, where they founded the Kievan Rus state by the end of the 9th century. The Kievan Rus state, with its capital in Kiev, was predominantly populated by Slavs. The impact of the Norse in this region cannot be overstated. The Kievan Rus became a powerful state of the Middle Ages that lasted until the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. It is seen as the historical predecessor to the modern states of Russia and Ukraine. The dynasty founded by Rurik continued until the end of the 16th century, when it was succeeded by the Romanovs on the throne of Russia. Following waterways, the Norse even reached the Black Sea to the south of Ukraine, and from there, Byzantium, with which they established trade connections. Some Norsemen even served as mercenaries in Byzantium, employed by the Eastern Roman emperors. Through a trade network that crossed Ukraine and Russia, goods from Byzantium reached Scandinavia, and some of these goods were even transported to the West. For example, Byzantine goods and coins may have made it to Britain via this network in the 10th or 11th centuries. While it had been successful in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Viking expansion began to stall. This was primarily because local defenses had been assembled against them with some success. In the 10th and 11th centuries, the Saxons or the Slavs had begun to train mobile cavalry forces to react swiftly to Viking attacks. At sea or on rivers, the Norse were untouchable, but they had to move on land too. Against foot soldiers, the cavalry force had the upper hand, a definitive advantage on mobility, which made it increasingly difficult for Viking invaders to combat inland. On occasion, they were spotted in time and confronted. One such instance occurred in 884 in East Frisia, located in the northwest of Germany, where a small Danish army was defeated. This ended the attacks on the region. Another method of subduing the Vikings was through assimilation. Notable examples of this strategy can be observed in Russia and Normandy. Once they established themselves as rulers in foreign lands, the Norsemen no longer wanted piracy and attacks on their own doorsteps, so they fought against it. However, it wasn't warfare, but rather political and procedural change that ultimately ended the Viking Age. This shift was coupled with the rise of larger centralized kingdoms in Scandinavia and their transition to Christianity, which accelerated during the 10th and 11th centuries. At the time, Scandinavia was divided into several small kingdoms or chieftaincies, all of which frequently engaged in territorial disputes, resulting in internal strife and battles between Norsemen. Kings of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were generally expansionists, constantly striving to unify larger territories. This practice had persisted for centuries, even predating the Viking Age. Yet, when some of these leaders converted to Christianity, it intensified the animosity, transforming these skirmishes into cultural or religious conflicts. Ultimately, Christian kings triumphed in all three countries, and the older Norse beliefs declined sharply, becoming virtually extinct in the 12th century. The now Christian Norse kingdoms were heavily influenced by the feudal states from the rest of Europe. Their conversion connected them to a religious area that spanned the majority of Europe. The culture of exploration and raiding that had been upheld for generations vanished in this new order. Although they maintained distinctive languages and traditions, the Scandinavian populations became bound to a Christian Europe, and their kingdoms now abided by the same rulers. The taste for long-distance expedition did not entirely vanish. The maritime tradition endured, with Scandinavians participating in the Crusades, for example. But there were no longer independent chiefs eager to launch expeditions beyond the seas for profit or expansion gain. The end of the Viking Age has been dated differently by historians, but they all agree it happened sometime during the 11th century. In the subsequent centuries, Nordic chiefs managed to retain some of their conquests outside of Scandinavia, reacquired forcibly on occasion. For instance, the Western Isles and the Isle of Man, located between Great Britain and Ireland, were still under Scandinavian control until the 13th century. Scotland took on its current form when it regained territory from the north between the 13th and the 15th centuries. Until 1469, Orkney and Shetland remained under the kings of Norway, so it was not all settled in the 11th century. Despite these events, the loud raids and the violence associated with the Viking Age certainly ended in the 11th century. The perception of Norsemen throughout history has been highly influenced by external views, primarily because, even though they had an alphabet and described themselves on rune stones, that is to say, engraved rocks with runes, they produced no literary legacy. The sagas, or texts, known as the Eddas for their mythology, were written later after their conversion to Christianity. The Norse were so feared and rejected by European populations that they were seen as threats due to their numerous attacks on monasteries and churches. Consequently, they became an archetype of violent, uncivilized, and pagan barbarians. This perception persisted for a long time, not fading until the 18th and 19th centuries. During this period, a new interest emerged in pre-Christian cultures, and a fresh appraisal began to take shape. Although this perspective also harbored its own biases, they differed from the earlier one. Influenced by Romanticism, the Norse were increasingly pictured as noble warriors with a strict code of honor. It was also during this time that cliches, such as the horned helmets, which are often inaccurately associated with the Norse, began to surface. Additionally, there was a rediscovery of their rich mythology, with its colorful stories, creatures, and gods that excited many imaginations. Norse mythology became a significant source of inspiration for fantasy literature. However, as we have seen, the Norse were far more than mere warriors. They were also traders, they farmed, and they had a complex society. So let's delve deeper into their society. What was it like to live in Scandinavia 1,200 years ago? Well, first, their society was divided into three main classes: the thralls, the carls, and the jarls. The first one, the thralls, was the lowest ranking class, and they were basically slaves. They could comprise as much as a quarter of the total population and belonged to others. The thralls worked as servants and farm workers. They were also employed for heavy construction work like roads or fortifications. New thralls were supplied by the sons and daughters of existing thralls, who were born into this class, or by capture. In raids, prisoners would be captured and either taken back to Scandinavia or sold. One of the practices the Vikings implemented was getting them to the Mediterranean and selling them to the Arabs in exchange for silver. Slavery was widespread in the Norse lands, totally accepted, and it only ended with Christianization, which condemned it. The second class, the carls, made up the largest part of the population, probably more than 2/3. These were free peasants who owned farms, land, cattle. If they were wealthy enough, they could also own slaves, but the majority did not. The carls produced food and would serve as foot soldiers in expeditions. Finally, on top of the social hierarchy were the jarls, the lords, the aristocracy of Viking society. They owned the large estates, long houses, horses, and often many slaves who made their estates work. The jarls were in charge of administration, politics, and welfare, and they took the initiative to go abroad on expeditions. Occasionally, when they died, their thralls, that is to say, slaves or serfs, would be sacrificed and buried alongside them to accompany them in death. People were born into these classes, but they were not completely closed. It seems occasionally someone could descend as a punishment or rise for distinguished service. There were also systems of mutual obligation between individuals. In addition to their social class, people belonged to communities connected by a certain trade, owned a sea vessel, or had military obligations to a certain lord or a certain leader. Assemblies were held in villages, attended by free people. There were local courts of justice. There were religious leaders and calendars guiding community life, and special councils known as the Things discussed important issues and decisions. Society was complex, and similar to other traditional societies of the time, women were subordinated to their husbands and fathers and held very little political power. Their situation often depended on their social class. Nevertheless, compared to the rest of Europe, they may have had more rights. They could inherit from their husbands and, if unmarried or widowed, could become heads of a family or clan leaders. This position would be transferred to their new husbands if they remarried. Any woman reaching the age of 20 without getting married was considered a free subject of rights as a man. Women could also divorce their husbands and remarry, a behavior that was unthinkable at the time in Christian Europe. Now, these were rules, the laws, but in practice, most free women from all carls and the jarls were housewives. However, marriage gave them a social standing and a degree of economic security. Being unmarried was precarious and potentially frowned upon socially. A person's social standing or class was immediately recognizable from their appearance. Men and women of the jarls, aristocracy, were typically well-groomed, a far cry from the disheveled appearance often depicted. They displayed their status by wearing expensive clothes, often silk from distant lands, and adorned themselves with crafted jewelry, brooches, belt buckles, necklaces, armories. Most of these pieces were crafted in Scandinavia, which showed the fine craftsmanship of the Norse at the time. Archaeological finds suggest a strong taste for grooming and hygiene was developed, and not just for the jarls, but also for the carls. It is common to find high-quality combs in the tombs of both jarls and carls. Their diet was diverse, including a variety of meats prepared, boiled, fried, cured, or smoked. There was plenty of seafood, bread, porridge, dairy products, nuts, vegetables, berries, and fruits. The specific food items relied on their location and harvest, which were not always favorable. Nonetheless, archaeology attests to a relatively healthy population compared to the standards of the time. Men averaged 1.7 meters, which is 5 feet 7 inches in height, and women 1.55 meters, 5 feet 1 inch, a relatively tall population for the period. Their garments were often made of linen and wool. Flax, a key crop for the Norse, provided oil, food, and, importantly, raw material for making linen. The Norse also had substantial wool production, used for clothes and making sails. They enjoyed exotic products obtained from trade. Apart from silk that came from Byzantium and was imported in large quantities and was found in many tombs, there were also spices, glass. Glass was often made into beads for decoration, and wine from Germany and France, which complemented their production of beer and mead. These items were paid for with valuable exports like amber, which is frequently found around the Baltic, fur, slaves, as I mentioned before, and textiles, as the Norse were skilled spinners and weavers of woolen cloth. There was much more to Norse culture and everyday life. But as you see, with their diverse crafts, their art, variety in their diet, their customs, and their complex social structure with laws and a writing system, the Norse were far from being an uncultured society often depicted through the chronicles of the Middle Ages. We are probably equally far from the image of a society of free, brave, and noble men that the romantic vision of the Vikings brought in the past 2 centuries. Starting with the word Viking itself, used today as a synonym for Norse. Its etymology is still a matter of debate. The term Viking emerged in English in the 18th century during the Viking revival to refer to the warriors from Scandinavia. In the 20th century, by extension, it came to name all the Scandinavian population of the Viking Age. So now, when we hear the term Viking, we think of medieval Norse. Before that, the Norse people had different names, such as Scandinavians. In northern Germany, Ascomani, literally Ashman. In Ireland, Dubgale or Fingale, meaning dark and fair foreigners, respectively. And Danes by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. The Franks called them Normans, and as we have seen before, they were also known as Varangians by the Slavs and Byzantines. With the end of the Viking Age, paganism went extinct. As the Scandinavians joined Christendom, they lost their reputation for ferocity. The Norsemen merged into history as their Old Norse language evolved into modern Scandinavian languages. Vegetation covered the rune stones, and the memories of their gods, their rituals, their adventures, and their world views slowly faded away. We have reached the end of our historical journey for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.